Good evening, everybody. So nice to see some faces and masks here tonight. We are thrilled to partner with the Institute of Design to host David Edwards here today. So I'm going to hand it over to the Dean of the Institute of Design, Dennis Weil, who will introduce our speaker, then you'll hear from me. I'm Mariam Saleh, I'm the Executive Director of the Kaplan Institute, after David's talk. Dennis.
Thank you, Mariam, and hello, everybody, and welcome to the Kaplan building with the Kaplan Institute and Institute of Design. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce David Edwards, who completed his PhD here at IIT with Darsh Vassan, who is here too. Oh, here, thank you, Darsh, in 1987. David is a scientist, inventor, and author, and also a long-standing faculty member of the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard University, and founder of technology, cultural, and humanitarian organization, from which has emerged Fend, a new hygiene design for the pandemic era that David will speak today. The Institute of Design and myself personally are very excited to be able to co-host David Edwards together with the Kaplan Institute for two reasons. One, using design and the design process for science is actually an emerging field, as you're probably well aware of, and that we all need to learn more about. And we at the Institute of Design have started to offer classes in biodesign and part of the Biodesign Challenge, but would love to do more and learn more about it. And second, something I've already told David before, I actually had the privilege in being, in 2015, sitting in a final presentation of his class at Harvard, as some of my colleagues in the fellowship program I did at the time had taken the class, and I was very impressed the way, David, you did brought together, as you call it, the art and science of creating things that matter. So with this, I'll give you David. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you so much. I am really super happy to be here, and it's a real honor to be here in the same room with Darsh Vassan, who invited me here many, many years ago. I'm going to dive right into my talk here, which has this sort of audacious title of Creating Things That Matter. And before I do that, I want to talk about something that matters in the natural world to all of us, and just analyze that a little bit. What does it mean that something matters, right? And so I have an image of the ocean, and I'm going to talk about the ocean. How many of you have actually been to the ocean? Yeah, most of you have been to the ocean. Yeah, okay. So I grew up really never having been to the ocean, but now I spend a lot of time. I actually live right on the ocean, and in fact, the ocean is kind of one of the simplest things in nature, right? It's like H2O. It's one of the simplest molecules. And it's 2/3 of the planet. So 2/3 of the planet covered with H2O, that's the ocean. But the ocean, of course, is much more than that. The ocean is this massive and complex macroorganism that has supported life on the planet as long as life has been here. And it will probably support life as long as life continues on the planet. And it has done so in a way by learning and adapting and evolving. In such a way that if anybody here had been asked to sort of create the ocean, you clearly wouldn't have been able to do that, right? So this is something that matters, and it matters for a very long time, as long as humanity has been here and longer. And who could have created that, right? And the answer is that nobody could have created that. And one of the stories that I will tell over and over again is that things that matter, that really matter for the very long time, are co-created. They're co-created by everybody, right? And so they wouldn't last for a very long time if that didn't happen. And so that's one of the secrets of creating things that matter. Now, this is an image that I took in 2005 outside of Johannesburg. I had come to work in South Africa with a new not-for-profit. I was funded by the Gates Grand Challenge. I was one of the first Gates Grand Challengees, and I was developing inhaled vaccine for TB and an inhaled antibiotic for multi-resistant TB. And I was traveling in the bush country outside of Johannesburg, and I saw these guys dumping garbage, and it had a big impact on me. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. So a little history here. I finished my PhD here in 1987 with Darsh. I was in applied math, chemical engineering, but my interest was in applied math, and I wrote a book with Darsh called Interfacial Transport Processes in Neurology, and it came out in 1991. And a couple years later, I had another book that came out, and at that time, I thought that was my life. I would be an applied math guy, and I had an audience of about 10 people. And as I said to one of you, my mother was constantly asking, what do I do, actually? And then I had the privilege of meeting another mentor in my life. Another thing I would say to all of you young students, mentors are important throughout your career. And they have certainly been important to me, beginning with Darsh. And this was Bob Langer at MIT, and I wrote a paper that came out in Science, and it was the first time I got into healthcare and imagined, well, how could you deliver insulin to the lungs without an injection and get it into the bloodstream? And people were working on that. It was kind of the biggest project in pharmaceutical industry, really, at the time in the late 90s. And people were using these big sort of air guns. And so we sort of figured out that if you made insulin look like a wiffle ball, you could actually get it efficiently into the lungs. And so I published that and then started a company. And I had never imagined I would ever do anything like that. And because it was the late 90s and because of that, the nature of that idea, we sold it very quickly. So it was the biggest accrual of value in biotech history, and it really had a big impact on me. It was very destabilizing, actually. And a couple years later, I began to teach at Harvard University, and the Anthrax scare happened. Now, most of you were probably not even born when that happened, or maybe you were, but it was a long time ago. At the time, there was a lot of fear. It was right after 9/11, and I was invited to Washington, D.C. in the meeting that led to Homeland Security. And the question was, well, how do we prevent people from weaponizing anthrax in the way that we had sort of weaponized insulin? And so that was kind of a hard or question to answer. And so I turned it around and said, well, what could we do to protect people from really anything? And so it became obvious, and it was really my work here at IIT that helped me see this, that if we put salt in the airways, we could get rid of these little respiratory droplets that carry disease, and that we hear a lot about because of SARS-CoV-2. And so we published that in 2004 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and then started another company called Matrix in 2005. And so here I was. I'd made a lot of money. I had published books, and I had started companies, started a not-for-profit, and I had a lovely family. And I had a home in Paris and a home in the United States. And gosh, I couldn't really have ever imagined being so successful in a certain way, and I was really frustrated. And I was frustrated because while what I had done had certainly mattered to me, it mattered to my wife and my 3 kids, it mattered to a number of people, but it really didn't matter in a big sense, right? And so my company that I'd sold for so much money, we were still 18 years away from a product, right? The first product came out in 2018, inhaled L-Dopa for Parkinson's treatment. And so I was really wondering, well, this all worked out really well for me, but I go back to that image. Here I am in Africa. I'm developing this inhaled vaccine. It became clear to me that there's no way this was ever going to become a product, not in Africa, right? The billion-dollar sort of investment needed for this vaccine, and then the infrastructure to distribute the vaccine. And so it was pretty clear to me that here I was aiming at a problem that really seemed to me to matter. There's no way that was going to be commercialized, and so I was kind of using South Africa as a lab, and it was not fair. And meanwhile, what we saw, at the time in the early 2000s, we saw infectious disease as being the big healthcare challenge. It still is in the developing world, but we began to see that a lot of our problems were starting to come into Africa as relative affluence came. And so cardiovascular disease and mental health issues and a lot of trash. And so what I saw in that image that I showed you was, well, here are scientists who are innovating and creating products that are food products and other kinds of products that are clearly delivering value, but something's not right here. This is not sustainable. And so it occurred to me that I need to be creating in a different way. Somehow I need to be in a broader dialogue, and I need to be bringing my innovation to bear to people today and in a different way. And so this led me to this ... between 2005 and today. And so I'd like to spend about 20 minutes talking about what happened in those intervening years, what did I learn, and then I'd like to spend the last part of this talk talking about Fend, which is for sure the thing that I've created that matters most. So I left the United States and I opened a cultural center in Paris called Le Laboratoire, the lab. And this was a center where we did experiments with artists and designers at frontiers of science, and we invited the public in to experience what was created. And you might say, well, why did you do that? Well, I had, in coming to Harvard, been exploring with myself and then with a lot of my colleagues, where did my creativity come from? Actually, I never imagined that I would start a company, and I'm sure Darsh never imagined that I would start a company or that it would be so successful. And where did that come from? It became clear to me that one of the important elements of my youth was my interest in the arts. I have always written fiction, and this was something I sort of did on the side. And it became clear to me in speaking, both in my own introspection and in speaking to a lot of my colleagues, that many creative people tend to create zones in their life where they can practice two kinds of thinking. One, in my case, I was a scientist, is the analytical, deductive, quantifiable, reduce a complex problem to a set of resolvable hypotheses. That's what I did at work. But I also created an environment where I could be inductive and intuitive. I could be comfortable with ambiguity, and I could be embracing uncertainty, and that was my fictional world. And that allowed me to be a risk taker. It allowed me to be empathetic. It allowed me to care and to listen, and it helped me be the innovator that I was in the late 1990s. And I regretted that I didn't have an environment that encouraged that. And a lot of my colleagues felt the same way, and it led to this book and to this idea of a creative center where we are experimenting, where there are no walls between artists and scientists, and where we create things that the public comes and experiences. Now, I had not forgotten the problem in Africa, and I had been thinking about, well, if plastic bottles are like a bad idea, what's the right bottle for water? And so, of course, the natural solution is the coconut, right? The coconut is sort of the perfect water bottle, right? You can cut it off the tree, it grows. You cut it off the tree, you send it around the world, you open it up, and it's got water in it, actually coconut water, and it's fresh, and it is nutritive, and the way that works is you have an endoderm, which keeps everything moist inside, and then you have an endocarp, which keeps it, the moist part protected. And if you think about it, that's kind of how we package food, but we do it with things that are not sustainable. And so we should be able to do something like that. And so we did an experiment, and we did lots of experiments like these, but I'll just tell you about this one. And this was with a French designer, François Azembourg, and he and I kind of imagined how would we make these things. And then we invited the public into an exhibition, which was inviting them into the process of our creation. And it got a lot of press and a lot of interest, and it led to some very funny stories. And it's one of the reasons why I ended up starting a restaurant in Paris and then in Cambridge. But what it really confirmed for me, a couple years later, there was a company. It was invested in by venture companies in the United States and also investors in Switzerland. And we won the Time Magazine Invention of the Year. And so for me, this was a confirmation of a model that was an innovation model that was, it was fun. It was something that the public enjoyed, that I enjoyed, all of us creators enjoyed. It's something that had a sustainability to it. It's something that allowed us to pose problems that it was not obvious that there was a big market opportunity, but there certainly was a big need, and it led to an innovation. And so that coincided with me bringing the laboratoire back to Cambridge, and I opened this. And it did become a restaurant very quickly, but in late 2014, and I began to write a new book. And so what I'd like to do here, I am going to talk about science and I'm going to talk about my work right now, but I'd first like to spend just about 10 minutes talking about what I've learned about creating things that matter and how it may be relevant to you all. So this book came out a few years ago. And the first thing I want to say is that from my perspective, we are all born creative. I think that we would not have survived, humanity would have not have survived had we not been creative. As you can think about it, it's hard for any of us to pass a day without being surprised, right? There's nothing in life that's really predictable. And so if we're not in a very constrained environment, we're typically in a situation where, whether it's driving a car or speaking to your mate or whatever it is, where you're confronted with something that you didn't predict. And so you kind of need to create a solution to that situation, and we do that all the time. And so from my perspective, and what I've learned about creating is as intuitive as this kid eating this apple. And not only is that true, but I think that creating things that last is also very intuitive. If you think back on just how do we create things that matter or things that are larger than a sandcastle, we typically need help. And we typically need resources. And so we typically need to convince people to help us and to give us resources. And so historically, that has led to a consideration not only of what we need right now, but what does the village need in the longer term. And it's generally led to a thought process that has produced things that have lasted for a very, very long time. Now, it's true that for as long as civilization has been here, we've created a lot of things that didn't last at all. But we did have a process, and we do have a process for creating things that last well beyond our own lifetimes. And from my perspective, that is still a very intuitive thing. Now, something's pretty radically changed today, and there's many reasons for this, and it has one to do with the scientific revolution, our understanding of nature. It has something to do with our understanding of economies and innovation economies, where now it's possible to have an idea, to translate that idea into a very mass scale thing, and to have an impact for a pretty short period of time but that matters for that short period of time. And not only is that true, but it's pretty true today that the pressure on innovation is towards innovating and creating things that don't last for a very long time. Actually, we're really motivated to make things like a car that kind of fail pretty quickly. And so that has led to a sort of existential crisis, the United Nations creating the Sustainable Development Goals, and massive thinking right now. For all of you young people, you are coming into a creative economy at an incredibly exciting moment. You know, when I was your age, there was a real question about what would I do. I enjoyed creating, but it was really not obvious, well, what was the need of me. Today, there's a need to really rethink how we create, and for reasons that are kind of related to some of what I'm saying here. And the model to bear in mind is the model of the lab. So how does the lab function? Now, you may think, well, the lab relates to the scientist, and that's true, but it actually relates to all of us. If you think about how any of us is confronting challenges in our life, and take something completely trivial, I lose a coin, and I'm sitting on my bed. I want my coin, and so I make a hypothesis that the coin is under the bed. I then test the hypothesis. I go and look and see, is it under the bed? It's not under the bed. So I've learned something, and I quickly make another hypothesis, and I make lots of hypotheses. I eventually find out where the coin is, and actually I've learned a lot by being wrong. And so there's this sort of experimental process that we all get, and people who are good at solving problems, whether it's writing a book or starting a company, tend to be really good at looking at failure as an opportunity. I learned something. And in moving forward. So generally, this idea of an experimental process is something that we all frame in our own lives. And the other thing I want to say about the experimental process, which is relevant, is that there's the process and then there's the outcome. And generally, if this is your process, this is not a teacher saying, this is what you need to do, but this is what you want to do, generally that outcome reflects who you are, what you care about, what you believe in. Could be a scientific article, could be a report on your company,
or it could be something like this, right? And so this outcome is generally reflective of you, and those of us who enjoy creating take that really seriously. And we look at it almost like a child, right? It's something that we've created and we care so much about it because it reflects who we are that we really want it to be perfect. Now, I share this and I show this to make a point. For the longest time, our created things have tended to express who we are in ways that didn't change very fast. So we could make a relief that expressed who we were at that moment, and actually it turned out to be true for a pretty long time. Things were not changing very rapidly. And so there was a pretty big distinction between process and outcome, right? So you kind of learned and you did. Now, that's changed pretty radically, and I think for the good, but it's turning upside down how we think about innovating and how we think about learning ultimately. So this, some of you may know, this is one of the most important contemporary art exhibitions of the last 30 years. In 2003, Olafur Eliasson did this installation in London at the Tate Modern, and it's a kind of a sun, this big glowing ball, and in the Tate Modern. And what happened once this went up was very surprising. People came in and they began to lie on their back, and they began to form these sort of letters and structures just spontaneously. And so it became this sort of co-created work that is very much like Yahoo. Right? Think about many of the companies that are really valuable today. What is Yahoo? Yahoo is a website. And so what is that website? Well, if you looked at the website 5 years ago, it's not the website today, and that website's changing constantly, and it's changing because you are interacting with it, actually. And so most of the really valuable companies are evolving with us. And so that's one of the learnings about creating today, is that the process and the outcome is increasingly one thing. And so that leads to a question of, well, what do we do at a university, right? So the model of learning, it wasn't true for much of civilization, but it has been true for the last several hundred years, is that we learn and then we do, right? And so at Harvard University, there's the Harvard College, and then there's all of the schools. And the schools are where you do practical things. There's the business school, and there's the design school, and there's the law school, the medical school, and you learn and then you do. Now, it's true that the engineering school is part of the college, and that's been a frustration, but actually it's reflective of the fact that actually it's pretty impossible today to learn and not do. In fact, again, all of you, and it's clearly reflected in the Kaplan Institute, are coming of age in the maturation of the maker movements. The maker movement began right after the first tweet, and it has really changed how we think and many people think about education. So I became, in my class, really interested in the maker movement and how we learn through the maker movement and what makes it work, actually. And so clearly what I do with startups and in creating things is part of the maker movement. But to analyze it a little bit further, the maker movement, or collaboratively creating, particularly when we're talking about doing new things, right? So I'm interested in doing things that have not been done before, like this little kid doing something completely new. There's a playful curiosity element, for sure. There's also this issue of being at a frontier and something bad could happen, actually. You're taking a risk. You're doing something nobody's ever done before. And if you notice, people who are pioneering are always buddied up, right? So there's always this sort of collaboration that happens. And it's not just a matter of, yeah, it's more fun to do with others. Actually, I can't survive if I'm not partnering with people. And so I began, and in my book, I spoke to and analyzed a number of creators who've created things that will clearly last for a very long time, artists and scientists and chefs. And one of these people is David Duboulet. David is one of the leading underwater photographers, and he invented the split lens camera, which allows you to take a picture above and below the water and kind of realize that we're all part of the same universe. And I asked David, well, clearly when you go diving, you dive with somebody. And so how do you choose your buddy? And he said, well, there's two things that are really important. And the second thing is that they be really curious. So that makes a lot of sense. So curiosity matters. But what's the first thing? He said the first thing, they have to be nice. Actually, there's nothing worse than to be diving with somebody who's like not a nice person. So I want you to bear that in mind for a second. And let me just talk about one more person who I talk about in the book, and it's Ferran Adrià. Some of you may know him. He's probably the best chef, the most impactful chef who's certainly lived in my lifetime, who started and ran El Bulli in outside of Barcelona. And every plate that Ferran made was new. So he made 1,846 plates in the history of El Bulli and completely changed how we think about food. And now, if you looked at how he created, it's very much how many of you professors create, right? So he had this ideation phase, pretty collaborative, and then there's the experimentation phase, and then there's the exhibition phase. In the exhibition, he'd actually serve food. And he did this rapidly. He learned, he created the most important restaurant of our time, but he did it meal by meal by meal. Now, of course, people didn't come into his restaurant thinking, I'm coming in as a guinea pig. He's going to test this on me. Actually, they came in looking for a really amazing experience. So one of the things that is true with all of these people who are creating things that matter, most of the time we're working on things that are not, they're not the ocean. They're not mattering in the big way that we may be hoping, but they matter in a kind of a small way. And so one of the things that all of us pay a lot of attention to is the dignity of the experience. There's something that is true with all really great creators, is that they really care about the beauty of the experience of the experimental object. And so that's clearly a Steve Jobs truth, but it's something that you see increasingly, and I speak to all of you who are in the design school. Design in this context is a vocabulary. It's a vocabulary that builds confidence and trust and is really ennobling participation in the experimental act. So I'm going to finish this part of the talk and just saying, in my book, I focus on these qualities that are listed on the left as qualities that I show in the book are ones that help creators not only survive at frontiers, but thrive at frontiers. Passionate curiosity, I mentioned empathy, I mentioned intuition. So creators tend to get really early on that the most valuable matter in their brain is the matter of their unconscious brain, actually. And so they're often looking to put themselves in situations where their cognitive skills are challenged, and so where they're forced to be intuitive. They like to put themselves in innocent situations where they don't know anything, and because they learn really fast, and they learn fast by being humble. Aesthetic intelligence, you can think of this as having the capacity of walking into any room and understanding what's funny. So there's something about being able to read a room. There's something about being able to understand what matters aesthetically here and right now, and they're very obsessive. Now, everything that I write on the right, those are qualities of winning the war, right? So it's important if you're starting a theater or you're starting a company or starting a university that you be really thinking about yourself and your department, your school. You be super competitive, you be logical, you understand your situation perfectly well, very confident, competent in your domain, and emotionally detached. All of that really, really does matter. What I have learned is that it's critical if you want to have an innovative environment where we're creating things that have not existed before, that can exist for a very long time, that there be a pioneering environment that's protected and that's safe, and that there be an execution environment that we would typically teach in the business school that is equally as important. And there needs to be this exchange between these two environments. And that's what you find in really creative Silicon Valley kinds of environments. Those two cultures coexist. That's not the purpose of my talk, but I just want to say that what I learned in those 15 years is that environment really, really does matter. So what I'd like to do here in the last 15 minutes of my talk, I'll go quickly, is talk about Fend. So I mentioned that my first company inhaled insulin, then the Anthrax, I got into this whole challenge of bioterrorism. And so what happened is when I went to France, I continued to think about the air we breathe. With every day, we breathe in about 15,000 liters of air. You drink about 3 liters of water. So that's a lot of air that we're bringing in, and that air changes you. It changes your biochemistry, it changes your health, it obviously oxygenates you, and actually it hydrates you. So I was always interested, well, how can you make every breath you take improve your life? Not just insulin once in a while, but every breath. And so my first idea was inhale food. Make food in the form of particles that when you breathe them in, they fall out in your mouth, and you don't have a food form. And there were benefits to that, and it led to a collaboration with Thierry Marx and a product called the Whiff. Thierry is a top chef in France. I began to experiment with liquid flavor that would be suspended in the air with the designer Marc Bretillot. And this led to Philippe Starck, who's easily the best known designer, industrial designer in France, who came to the laboratoire and said, hey, I really want to work together. And I was kind of terrified what that meant. And we ended up creating something called a WA, where you gave this experience to other people. Massimo Bottura, who's the #1 chef in the world, came over for a weekend to make flavor clouds. And so we began to experiment, and I became really fascinated with this whole space of olfaction. The Nobel Prize was won in 2004 for understanding the basic biology of olfaction, and I became really interested in, well, how can you scent is such a powerful and intimate thing, and as I learn more, it is fundamental to our survival, and so I created this platform for delivering scent and flavor, and so this led in 2015 to a product called the O-Phone with my former student, and then eventually, just before the pandemic, we were moving into the food industry with devices that were creating flavors that would allow us to change the experience of food without having anything ingested, and so this led to the pandemic. Now, when the pandemic hit in March, and we began to see the super spreading events, it became clear to a few of us who had been the early pioneers of respiratory droplets. This was a respiratory droplet problem. And so I approached the FDA through Bob Langer, who was the head of the scientific advisory board of the FDA for many years, and spoke to Janet Woodcock, who leads the drug division, and said, I think that if you just put salt through the nose, you could land it right here in the upper airways, and I think you could probably have a big impact on COVID-19. Now, there were many hypotheses in that, and I'm not going to get into all of them, but I do want to explain just a little bit how the lungs work. And this is really relevant to you in terms of the current pandemic, and hopefully more relevant than that. So our nose, our mouth, you have then this, actually I don't know how to point here. So you have then this long tube, it's called the trachea, and right here you have the larynx. Talk more about the larynx. And what happens in the lungs, then you have the trachea branches into the main bronchi, and then you have 23 generations, and you come down to the gas exchange region. Now, what's important when you breathe with every breath is the air gets humidified, right? It needs to get wet, so that by the time it gets down here in your lower lungs, it's completely wet, and it cleans out. Particles get pulled out. Pathogens fall out. Carbon, whatever's in the air falls out. Most of it falls out. And if the airways are properly hydrated, it lands on mucus, it gets swept to the mouth, and you swallow it. So you may be infected by COVID-19, by SARS-CoV-2, but you don't even know it because it just gets cleared to your mouth, and that's true for most people who get infected by SARS-CoV-2. Now, what happens is it turns out when the airways are dry, and it happens a lot. Either you're systemically dry, the older you get, the more dehydrated you become. Many conditions, including lung infection, cause dehydration, or you're breathing dry air. it suddenly begins to work not so well, and it breaks up in these little droplets. That was the hypothesis, although there were many people at the time who said, oh, we think these respiratory droplets come deep in the lungs. So we began to do studies in the summer of 2020. We've done now 9 human studies, and 1 is happening this week. And I want to talk to you about what we've learned. So this here is showing the number of particles you breathe out, okay, per liter of air. And it shows it for 150 people, and as you can see, there's like 30 of those people are breathing out a lot. And most of those people are breathing out very few particles. And so the question is, well, why are some people breathing out many more particles than others? And we have found that while age matters, the older you get, the more likely you are to make more particles. BMI matters, and infection matters. And so you get infected with COVID-19 or the flu, and your numbers of particles go up. And once the infection leaves, they go down. And so all of these states, by the way, are states of dehydration. So then we said, okay, what happens if you put in salt? Why does salt water matter? Well, the way your airways keep hydrated is by a balance of salt and water. So you have salt and water and other things in your airways. As the water evaporates to moisturize the air you breathe, the salt concentration goes up. And that pulls water out of cells by something we call osmosis and keeps the airways hydrated. So there's this balance of water and salt. So if you want to hydrate the airways, water doesn't work. You need to put in water with salt. So we said, okay, let's put in salt water through this thing called Fend, and let's have the droplets just the right size so they deposit in your trachea. So what happens? So in fact, everyone, now we've done over 500 subjects, young, old, India, Germany, United States, polluted air, non-polluted air, COVID-19 infected or not, and then everybody that looks like this. So you get, initially you're breathing out, say 1,000 particles per liter. You do this, and I'm going to give all of you this experience here. So you kind of push this like that, and then you breathe deeply through your nose. You should do that twice. And the number of particles that you generate goes down by 50, 80, 90, 99%, and it lasts that way for about 6 hours. So this made me and many of us begin to wonder, well, gosh, this seems really relevant and important, and maybe it's relevant to how masks work, everything you're wearing right now. One of the things that really bothered us is, why are masks seemingly so helpful? There's a lot of data that shows even cotton masks seem to be helpful in lowering incidence and risks of COVID-19, but they're not very helpful at stopping these little particles. If I measured the particles in the air right now, there's about maybe 10,000 particles per liter, and 90% of those are smaller than a micron, not very well captured by masks. Masks are really meant for this kind of air. So why are they helpful? They may be humidifying the upper airway. So I was contacted by the NIH, who've been following our work, and said, hey, maybe that's how masks work. So we said, okay, let's test that. So we basically said, okay, you're in a dry room like this room, put on a mask, and now let me start measuring your exhale aerosol. So the exhale aerosol starts high and it goes down, just wearing a mask. It goes down. So you're humidifying your upper airways. I take the mask off, it goes back up. So it kind of looks like Fend. It just lasts for about an hour. Well, what happens if you go in a humid room? You're in a dry room. I just bring you into a humid room for 20 minutes. It gets rid of you're hydrating the airways, it gets rid of these little respiratory droplets. So just humidity does it. So what if I just put salt, like water, no salt, in a deposit right here where you need to hydrate your airways? Well, nothing happens because there's no salt. So when you put the water in, osmosis pulls that water out. So it's like you didn't put anything in at all. And so you need to put in salt. So you put in like salt at the concentration of the body, and it looks like you're wearing a mask. You're delivering those droplets again right here. Well, what happens if you do hypertonic? That means you have more salt in the solution than is in the body, so it pulls more water out, it's more hydration, it's even a more significant effect. It still lasts for just about 90 minutes. But what if you do a divalent salt, like calcium? It looks very different. And so we've shown in other work that what happens is the calcium, Alex, you would understand this, so the calcium acts on anionic surfactants and on mucins near the surface. It holds them together, increases surface elasticity, and it lasts. So with Fend, you can have the effect of what is effectively sea air in 2 breaths, right? So 10 seconds, and it lasts for 6 hours. So and by the way, it doesn't matter whether it's calcium or magnesium, so it doesn't really matter on the ion. It's just, so that raised the question. So there's a lot of data you may or may not know. There's been a lot of data showing that actually humidity helps. So humid room is better than a dry room for lowering risks of COVID-19 incidents and symptoms. So what about being near the sea? Like, would salt exposure matter? Now you might say, well, so we looked at COVID-19 in the United States from January through March, when the vaccination had started to really take hold, and looked at incidence and death, and collaborated with my colleague at the School of Public Health, Francesca Dominici, whose work on pollution and COVID-19 has made a lot of news over the last year. And she has an ecological regression analysis that allows us to say, okay, we can count for age, we can count for political persuasion, and we can have 10 different variables that could lead to a significant change in COVID-19 incidence and death. And here's what we found. So the top two graphs are showing in urban and rural counties right on the sea, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Gulf, the left to right. And so the top graph is incidence. So what is the probability that you got COVID-19? Well, it was pretty much, the line is the national average, and so it pretty much didn't really matter unless you were on the Pacific coast or unless you were on the Gulf of Mexico. Now, and what about death? So the bottom graph is showing death, the same thing. So there's about 25 or 30% less chance of incidence or death by salt exposure, take away all the other exposure. And why on those coasts? Because those are the two coasts. The Pacific coast, you have a wind that's blowing off the sea, and there's a lot of data on sea salt aerosols that you need a wind of a certain speed, and it needs to be blowing onto the sea, onto the land. And on the Gulf Coast, particularly on the Pacific, on the Texas Panhandle, you have the same phenomenon, and so that's where these effects arise. So it happens that there's a lot of data that shows that upper airway hydration has an impact on COPD and asthma and influenza, COVID-19. So we've figured out how to create an instant hydration with a little bit of salt and water. And we've published a series of articles, and we have a new article that we're putting together right now. And I'm going to talk about it in just a minute. But what I want to say is that it's pretty clear to us that there's a new hygiene. Right, there's been 5 hygienes over the last 3,000 years have been introduced. We believe that this is a new hygiene for respiratory health. Every bit the equivalent of what washing your hands are to your gut, this is to your lungs. And so there's a bit of a mission right now to get this into as many hands as we can. Now, who wants to see how this works? Does anybody? We don't have much time actually, but I have a minute. Could you want to see this? How this works? So, okay, I'm going to watch you a fast minute, and you're going to see how. So this is a colleague of mine, Mark. Okay, so Mark we're going to count his particles, and here's a machine. It's a particle counter. You see the lower number is the total number of particles in his lungs, and it starts out at like 10,000, the number in the air, and then he's got a few hundred. He takes Fend. This is the original Fend, and then we wait 15 minutes later. He's going to come back, and we're going to measure. Now, the number of particles goes down to 70 or 100, and these are the total particles up to about 5 microns in the air. We wait another 15 minutes, and now the particle numbers are down to 15 or 20, and it's going to continue. We went on for a couple hours, but you see this just really now what what we've done here in the last year, as we're learning, still the question is, does it really matter to COVID-19? Do you really know? So we didn't know. All we knew was it cleans. And so we began to market and sell this, which is just a hack of the product that we'd already developed. We won the Time Magazine Invention of the Year. And we've had about 1 million experiences here in the United States and in India. And in fact, the product has been used a lot in India, and particularly in Bangalore. And so, actually, I somehow missed, hold on here a minute. Oh my gosh, I think I missed a slide here. This is not my final presentation. So you know what? Let me tell you, so the product has been used in Bangalore, at Bangalore Baptist Hospital. And it was being used through the spring. and a phenomenal woman who leads healthcare at the Bangalore Baptist Hospital, and she also oversees the health of 1 million people in the slums of Bangalore, was conducting a study measuring exhaled aerosol in COVID-19 patients. And spring happened, and she, 4 of her technicians died in the PCR lab. It was a horrible, horrible situation. And so they made a decision to begin treating COVID-19 patients who were coming into the hospital, and they did a random control study. COVID-19 patients either got a Fend for 3 days, 3 times a day, or a nasal saline control. It was such a mess that we couldn't really communicate, so we didn't really know what was going on. The results came back in May, and what we found, which we'll be publishing here in our next paper, is that symptoms went away. In the Fend case, they all remained unchanged. In the nasal saline case, drug intervention by steroid or IV intervention went down radically in the Fend case, and most importantly, oxygen saturation went up in the Fend case, and that surprised us. Is what's going on? And so it led all of us to getting watches that measure our oxygen saturation, and we've been studying. And so what we've learned, and again will be in our next paper, is that actually what happens is that when you get dehydrated, and you do in early stages, you do in general in COVID-19, but you do when you run, is you get dehydrated, your larynx dries out. And as your larynx dries out, the vocal cords can't expand as much, and you begin to restrict oxygen. And so not only do the number of particles you could go up, but the oxygen goes down. And so when you, so if any of you were to run, and so one of the studies that we're doing this week is with athletes, and we're having them all run, you measure their exhaled aerosol before they run and after they run. And after they run, they're making like 10 times more. Their oxygen goes down. If they fend in the middle, the oxygen doesn't change, and the particles actually go back to normal. So the consequence of airway hygiene is broad. So I am going to finish here by saying that we now are bringing the product out as a mass market product. We've partnered with a really well-known designer, Robert Brunner, who designed the Beats by Dr. Dre, and he was the lead designer at Apple, who hired Johnny Ive, a really amazing man and designer. And so Fend looks like this, and my colleague Johnny, so Johnny here is going to actually, you can just start walking around. I'm going to explain. So this product is coming out. It's not public yet. It'll be coming out in another 10 days. And I'm going to, now watch me how it, everybody, now let me show you how this works. So you're all looking at it. Look at me, look at me, look at me. Okay. So what you're going to do is you're going to squeeze it. And when you squeeze it, there's going to be a cloud comes out, okay? And squeeze it, and then it goes off. So what you want to do is you want to point it at your nose. And as you squeeze it, you're going to deep yoga breath, okay? Yeah, and it's going to feel like you just fell off your surfboard, right? So this is, yeah, you do it twice. You do it twice, and now everybody do it if you want. This is salt water, and it's salt that's in your airways. And we should have done this at the beginning of the talk, but anyway, it was too early. So if you go to hellofed.com, you'll see our website. It'll change radically on the 25th, and we are also contributing with sales of the product to a not-for-profit, Next Breath, which is intending to get clean air to the people who need it most. As you may or may not know, respiratory disease is the #1 killer in the developing world, and there's kind of nothing more primitive and easy to dispense than salt water. So I'm going to end by just saying that creating things that matter, and just keep. Yeah. So if now I've lost all of my attention here. I just have 2 more minutes, and then you can go. So, creating things that matter is really a life, right? And it's a life that's, from my perspective, is a fun life. Actually, it's a very young life, right? And you're around people who care. You're taking risks, and if people don't care, they don't survive in a certain way. And so it leads to a sort of self-selection of people who are very mindful. They tend to be very empathetic. They tend to listen really well, and it's super empowering to be learning. Eventually, you will do something that matters, I promise you, and particularly if you keep in a dialogue with the public. And in my own experience, I guess, is that it doesn't feel very different than the whole process of creating something, because there's really no difference, actually, between outcome and process when it comes to creating things that last for a very long time. So the last thing I'll say is that if anybody comes to Boston, I do have a restaurant which is opening up next to MIT called Senses. It opens up in late November, and so come in and say I want to see David, and if I'm not around, if I am around, I'll come and we'll have a coffee or a drink or whatever. But this is the outcome of the laboratoire. Place does matter. Getting together with people you don't know really does matter, and I'd love to see you there. So I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was a very thought-provoking talk, and I really enjoyed using your product. It's very refreshing. So we have, I prepared a few questions for you, but we have incredible people in the audience today. You know, we have a number of our trustees, including Ed Kaplan, the namesake for the building, Joel Kraus, Jenny Neiman, Stacy Kasek, and Amanda Lannert. We also have a number of student entrepreneurs. You know who you are. We have various faculty members. We have our incredible staff at the Kaplan Institute who pulled off this event. You all have really great ideas, and you probably have a ton of questions for David. So please let me know and raise your hand if anything comes up. No, and I could probably, can I take mine off? Yeah, is that all right? Okay, yeah.
I was told that on the stage you didn't need your mask, and so if that works, that's great.
This is much more comfortable. All right. So let's start with Fend, and let's hear a little bit more about what you several times in your book and in your talks you talk about creating a fun environment for students, and it's kind of an ideal environment for creativity. When you think back to what went into building Fend to where it is, was there a fun time at the beginning?
Absolutely. It was. I mean, it was all fun. I mean, I'll tell you a few, and I think if you were my mother, you would say that was terrifying, but it was actually really fun. And so, we began with not really knowing whether, back in the early days, whether there was something there. And so we did a first. I was invited to give a talk at Wired magazine in London at their national, their annual conference, and we thought, let's try something. We were going to try, and this was like the early days of what led to this. And so I would give a talk, and I would invite everybody to make a virtual coffee opera. And so we gave them an app, and you could choose like what do you want to smell first? It's like, first I want to get the almond, and then I want to get, and you could kind of create. And then after the talk, you came out, and there was a bar set up, and you could actually smell these digital scents. And of course, everybody did it at once, and so they crashed the app, and so we're like, oh, really terrified. Finally came, and I say all of this because this company began because of the following thing. So that was pretty fun, and people were having a lot of fun. But one of the guys, his head was shaved, and he kept coming back. And he then hung out, and he said, I had an accident, and I lost my memory, and I'm getting my memory back. And as you may know or not know, scent is effectively memory. Scent is processed very near the hippocampus. And so if I were to take, let's say some of you like coffee or like scotch, if I were to say, well, think of coffee or scotch, and I did a brain scan, it would mostly be like 85% would be olfactory. Right? And so you remember so he said, now I could say raspberry, and I could smell it. And so we, oh my gosh, there's something really fundamental here. So it was a discovery. We were having fun, but something really serious happened. I'm going to say one other thing. So we then we're trying to figure out, well, before the pandemic, how could this be really broad? And so we were thinking about sending
scent messages, and we created an app so you could sort of, any food picture, you could kind of put a scent on that food. And so we did a demonstration in New York City with the New York Times that we were going to send a scent from New York to Paris. And so I was with my student, and so the night before, we're in New York, and the machine didn't work. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning. And so it was like a nightmare. So I'm going to tell a secret, which I shouldn't tell anybody, actually, but we faked it. Actually, we went in, it was the New York Times, it was everybody, we had the people. And so we just kind of, I said to her, there's just these moments. And so, no, I want to say there that I don't know how many of you have seen the documentary on Theranos. Do you know who Theranos is? Yeah. So one of the things that comes out, this is a massive fraud, really. It was a company that was started in Silicon Valley, and it was a blood detection company. And what happened was that the entrepreneur and the company in the end ended up lying, actually. Now, one of the realities of the creative life or the entrepreneurial life is you're often needing to sell what doesn't exist, right? And so that's a pretty fragile place to be. And so how do you handle that, right? So what needs to be true, and this has at least been my principle, is you never should sell something that doesn't exist if you don't take it upon yourself to make it exist. You may die. And so I've said that to many people, that being the entrepreneur that I am, I'm kind of giving you a knife. Just saying, you know what? I don't know. I think it is going to happen. And so what happens, my experience, is that you do it. It may not be exactly what you promised would happen, but you kind of figure something out and you sort of realize it. And so that was one of those moments it was pretty fun. It was also pretty scary, actually. And so that was a couple of the moments. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I often think about the Theranos case, and it comes up in a lot of conversations with my friends, and I try to explain that, entrepreneurs often have to sell something that doesn't exist. But I think she probably stepped over a line. And in healthcare, it's even more difficult because you kind of need to have market approval from the FDA before you say anything meaningful about your product, right? So it's hard to sell without having something, right?
Well, it's a long topic. I think that what if I could say, I think that in the pharmaceutical industry or in the IT, I think there are two cultures for selling things that don't exist yet. They both do it. So my first company I sold for a lot of money, and we were 20 years from having a product. But it was understandable, the science was understandable, and the process of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 is understandable. Somebody who was knowledgeable could look at the science, could look at the IP and say, yeah, this is real. Yeah. And we understand the risks. What she was doing, she was actually in that between those two cultural innovation models, and she was exploiting the system. So she was really, you had nobody on the board who knew anything about healthcare, actually. And so anyway, it's a long...
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I've heard some about it. So the other thing is, so you talked about having fun with Fend. So you're a pretty unique person because you've crossed a chasm, right? You work with a lot of people at the ideation stage, and you've also translated those ideas into the market and commercialized products multiple times. So how are you able to do that? And what do you attribute to your ability to really cross this chasm?
So I think that, firstly, one of my motivations for going all the way was an inherent fear that this was not going to matter. And I have had the experience of creating and then handing it to somebody and seeing it die, which was very painful. Now, to be honest, and it gets back to it takes a village, I'm a terrible CEO. I'm not just, all of the skills that I kind of maybe am talking about make me really bad as a CEO. Like I'm good in the early stages where we're kind of figuring it out, but then there's a lot of whiplash, as you can imagine, with me. And so what I've learned is that there's a certain moment where you need to bring in real professionals, and it's this again. I don't want to give too long an answer. I want to say that for all of you who are creating, and I spoke to some of you here earlier, there's this fascinating early stage where anything's possible, and then you go through these different phases and there become more constraints, and you all sort of need to feel it
I've left companies. When I sold my first company, I was invited to be the CEO of the mother company, and I felt like an animal in a cage, and I just didn't feel right, actually. And so there's a certain moment where it no longer feels right, but it's true that my own experience of having followed the process along, it is so empowering, and it's such a learning experience to carry things all the way, that it's something I've done a few times.
So we have a few members, we have a few representatives from the mayor's office here, and we're very focused on building an entrepreneurial ecosystem in Chicago, and Illinois Tech is contributing to that. So you had mentioned that Silicon Valley has the two cultures present at the same time.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And I'm not saying we're going to do the same thing here, but I'm curious to hear more about that.
So if I know of 3 cultures like this, and they exist everywhere actually, but in terms of like a real economic powerhouse, I would say New York for Broadway theater, Silicon Valley for information technology in the Boston area is one I know. And so what makes those things unique? So in fact, you've got typically a learning hub. Could be a Stanford University, it could be an IIT, or it could be a New York University. But you have a place where people learn, and the value proposition is that I'm learning. So I get credit for passing time to learn. So there's a learning environment. A lot of ideas coming out of learning environments. You've got an environment where people are paid to fail. It's really important to be paid to fail, and that's what happens in startup communities. Startup communities, we're constantly failing, actually. And so now, of course, being paid, you don't get paid to fail. You fail right. But you got a place where I can leave. I can go into this university environment or this failure environment and can test ideas. And then you've got an environment where you actually make things, and there's a market, like there's Broadway, or there's Apple, or there's Genentech, or Biogen, or whatever. And so what now makes the culture, so you have those 3 things, and actually Chicago has it, everybody has it. So what makes the culture? So you have people who've got 1 foot here and 1 foot there. You've got institutions that allow that, Stanford or wherever it is. And those people give the students or the faculty the confidence that they're not betraying themselves by going into this environment. They kind of feel like, because when I left the first time I'd been with Darsh, I was really terrified of this whole thing. And so you kind of need help to go over there and go a little bit and come back. And so you have that. And then you have the same thing between this environment, which is a really cool vibe in the startup world, kind of the off-Broadway environment, and then into the Broadway. And so you trust. So there's this, it is true that the values at IIT or at Harvard University or at Apple are different. And it's kind of a big gap. But Apple will not survive. It does not actually acknowledge and value and celebrate the values at IIT, and vice versa. And so that it takes some of those special people who kind of bridge, and typically it's organically grown, right? And so they started out, they left the university, they kind of figured it out. And what happens is that when people have done that, and I think actually you have a founder here of the Kaplan Institute, is a perfect example of it. When you've done that, you like to see other people do it. You learn so much. So that's exactly what creates culture.
Thanks. So another thing that we're doing here at the Kaplan Institute is really thinking about how we advance equity in entrepreneurship and make it available for more accessible for people who may think that startups aren't for them. What are your thoughts around that?
So I think this, again, you're asking really big questions. And so I think that, again, I came from an environment where I was definitely, and Darsh and Alex nobody would have guessed that I would. So I think there has to be a fun entry. And so you and I have talked about food as an interesting environment. I find food and playing with food is a really interesting place because the food system is being radically rethought, and it has to do with health and education. And so it's kind of finding places where people can play without diving in is important. Mentors are a big deal, and role models. I think that making sure that you have here, and I have already met a couple people like that who are successful out in the outside world and are coming here and can be mentors and occasionally take students away, and so that fluidity I think is also helpful.
Thank you. So you teach a course on innovation or idea translation. So what's your philosophy for that course? How do you meet students where they are and inspire them?
So the philosophy's changed over time and for various reasons, but generally my goal is to give students the confidence that they can realize a dream. So I think that what happens in the early phases of translation is you get confident, right? And you kind of believe. And so firstly, being able to dream at all. So initially at Harvard, that was a big challenge. I couldn't get students I can still remember students saying like at the beginning of the class, like, well, what if I don't have an idea? And I said, that's crazy. It's like I have 100 ideas every day. Most of them are stupid. And she was like, I don't want to be saying a stupid idea. Like, I didn't get to Harvard by saying stupid ideas. And so actually, that's changed. People now, I think the internet has made it such that people are just used to sharing stupid ideas. And so that's now an easy thing. That's good. But believing in your ability to realize a dream is everything. And so I try to create experiences in the class where students can kind of go A to Z and sort of then do a really nice presentation. I tend to work really hard with them to make a really beautiful presentation. So often they're kind of shocked at how nice this presentation is. It feels like it's real. And entrepreneurs do that all the time. They kind of seduce themselves into believing that it's real by convincing other people. And so, we do that. And then we've tried to, with these, to create experiences that students can, if they really want to, can continue with their idea. But that's the basic concept.
So I have one last question for you, and before I do that, I'll mention, because it's related, that for the attendees, if you're hungry, there will be pizza available in Tell Labs at the end of this event. So please stay and grab yourself a bite. So when we were talking earlier today, I had asked you, we're thinking about the space that we've created that's supposed to foster collaboration and innovation, and how we can continue to refine it towards that purpose. Originally it was designed to enhance collisions across different stakeholders that we bring into the space. And I asked you, what could we do to build that culture? What's missing? What would you do?
Well,
share what you thought.
Yeah, so maybe to say a little bit different than what I said earlier. I mean, I think that you want to create an environment that allows your young people to take control, right? And so I think that the more they can have control over what happens in this environment to a degree, or the more this becomes a fascinating place to learn. And so, I talk a lot about food, and I'm really interested in that on so many different levels. And so I think that if I were to, do something here, I would probably create the coolest food experience in Chicago. And I would just say, you know what? We're going to make the coolest food experience in Chicago. And now what does that mean? And I mean, it's not something that's going to cost $1 zillion, but it would be something that everybody'd want to come to and you'd be proud of, and that would allow students and faculty, and you've got an amazing food program, but actually it would encourage really simple kind of experiences, like not food fights, but something really primitive. It's like food is amazing, but it would have this excellence that went along with it. It might be just one night a week. It's like the thing. You have to come to this thing. You get amazing chefs that come in, something. But Food, as I've said before, it's healthcare, it's environment, it's sustainability, it's aging, it's obviously nutrition, it's mechanical engineering, it's computer science. I mean, we're now in the automation phase. I have a restaurant, so automation is all about. It's like 3D printing. It's like so many. It's policy. Right, and so there's a lot to say, but that's probably I'd do something like that.
That's great. It's probably no surprise that our idea shop manager Patrick is an incredible pastry chef. You know, he likes to make things. David, thank you so much for your time today. This was a great talk, and thank you for answering the questions. So before we leave, any questions from the audience? Nope. Oh, we've got one. Is that Frank? Hi, Frank.
Have you thought about this service, for people with allergies or asthma? What's the effect there?
Yeah. So in fact, we've sold over 10,000 of these things, and so we have a lot of consumers who use it. And so one of the top feedbacks is that I'm not taking my allergy meds. This has so for allergies, so it hydrates, and so histamines, it dilutes histamine content, and so if you start to get an allergy attack, you take it, and it really clears it away. So that's a very common comment. If you get exercise-induced asthma, it's another cure, basically, and so this exercise-induced asthma happens again here in the glottis. So this thing I'm describing about opening up your glottis, and so it's tends to be really helpful. But I went too quickly. There's so much data about the long-term benefits to lower respiratory tract disease from COPD to the flu that what we're trying to do when this product comes out, if you buy the product, you will get a little note from me, and I will say to you that I'm going to guarantee this makes you breathe better. If it doesn't, we'll give you your money back. But you have to do me a favor. You have to take a 21-day challenge. And in that 21-day challenge, you get a text every day, and there's a video, a 1-minute video. And we help you understand how do your lungs work, how do they try to work to clean the air, how does this matter, how can you measure its effect, how can you feel it, and how does it matter to your own health. So this is education. We're trying to make those kinds of, if you think about soap, I don't know how many of you know the story of soap, but soap was around for a very long time before it was concluded in the middle 19th century that actually it's a good idea to wash your hands before you perform surgery. And so still, doctors wouldn't pick it up until the Civil War. And it was found that if you put soap in the backpacks of soldiers, they had a better chance of surviving. So the first ivory soap was right after the Civil War. So it took all of that for it to be like, soap, give me soap, right? And so we're trying to get to that point, but yeah, that's the answer. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, thank you, David. Also wanted to quickly thank Alice Barda. This event couldn't have happened without you. Thank you.